I found this little pictorial bottle at a flea market recently and just really thought it looked neat, so I brought it home. Now, this story goes back over 200 years, and even I had a hard time keeping everything straight with this one. So let's see what this story holds on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. Our story starts with a guy named Abram Nash. Now, sometimes he was referred to as Abraham. He was born in 1783 in Connecticut. There's just not a lot of good information on ancestry for that far back, unfortunately, but we do know that he and Sally had 5 kids. I found this really helpful resource in old Google Books, written in 1903, called 100 Years of Brewing, which tells the very earliest details of this brewery. It says in 1825, Abram and his son Alfred began Nash and Company in Troy, New York. Soon after, they realized that they needed to establish an agency in New York City to extend the sale of their ales. Meanwhile, Abram's daughter Mary married a guy named Ebenezer Beadleston. Ebenezer Beadleston was born in 1803 in New York. Beadleston was put in charge of the New York City firm in 1837. In 1840, the firm became known as Nash, Beadleston and Company. About 1845, they purchased the old state prison building. Here's an illustration of what the prison building looked like in 1814. The building was at Charles Street and West 10th Street. The state prison building had been built in 1797 and was replaced by the Sing Sing prison in 1828. So they purchased the building in 1845 and they opened for business in 1846. This illustration is the brewery in 1846. It was at this time that it was called Empire Brewery. I thought it was interesting. They used the prison cells for malting rooms, and they built 3 more stories on top of the foundation. So they ran the Troy branch and the New York City branch of this brewery for about 10 years. In 1856, they separated the locations. The New York City location was run by Ebenezer Beadleston and Alfred Nash, so it was called Beadleston and Nash. I don't have a lot of information about the Troy location, but I see that Alfred is over there in 1857 as a brewer, and he's with a guy named Barnes. So I guess he was involved in both locations. So 1857 is the first New York directory that I can access. So I found that all the information was correct so far, but I also found that Abram's youngest son John is also involved. I followed him around for a while, but I don't think he stayed in brewing for very long. So a couple years later, in 1860, Alfred Nash retired from the New York City location. There was a guy who had been working there for over 10 years, and his name was Walter W. Price, and he partnered. So as we can see from this 1862 directory, the firm is now called Beadleston and Price. So let's add that to the list. Soon he partnered with a guy named Ernest Woerz. I had to go look up how to pronounce this name because I want to call him Warts, but I went and checked and it says to call him Woerz. So I'm going to try to remember that. So him and both Beadleston's sons came on, William and Alfred. Now the name was Beadleston, Price, and Woerz, as we can see from this 1870 directory. Are you keeping up with me here? If we can run down a quick rabbit hole here, Walter Price was an interesting guy. He was born in England in 1820. He married a girl before immigrating to America. He had 1 kid with her, and then he abandoned her once he got here. That's how the article states it. Very soon after, he was married to another lady, having 5 kids with her. After he was done with that one, he abandoned her, and then married a 3rd wife, having 3 kids with that one. He was in court a lot, apparently. In this 1874 article, it says he owns a house worth $1 million. And according to this article, he goes by Colonel Walter Price. He sure thinks highly of himself. Another article pops up and saying that one of the wives described him as, quote, having a violent and ungoverned temper, and drove her from home with threats of violence from fear of her life. Now, one cool thing about Mr. Price is that he had a few sons, one of which had the middle name Nash, and the other one had the middle name Beadleston. And I thought that was pretty cool of him. They must have been a pretty close-knit family, though they were just partners of a business. So supposedly, in 1871, 68-year-old Ebenezer retired, leaving the two sons to run it. But I found an 1875 directory, which is 4 years after this, stating that Ebenezer is listed as president here. Now he'd be 72 now. So Abram Nash died in 1871 at the age of 88, and I'm not really sure why, but his son Alfred also died that year at age 63. But I didn't see an obituary for him. Remember, Alfred was involved in both breweries at both locations, so my guess would be that his partner over at the Troy location kept that one going. But I don't have any more information on that location. Here's a 1877 article in Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, and it talks about a carnival procession, we would call it a parade these days, for His Majesty, but honestly I can't read the name on it. So this float represented our guys at Beadleston, Price, and Woerz. Now a little bit about Ernest Woerz. He was born in 1834 in Germany. He had 4 kids, 2 girls and 2 boys. And in this 1880 census record, it shows his 18-year-old son Frederick is working at the brewery. Now Ernest wasn't in the papers very much until he died, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Walter Price died in 1876, leaving his share to his son, Walter Price Jr. In 1878, Walter Price Jr. retired, so that was just 2 years he was into it. And he left the 2 Beadleston brothers and Woerz. So the business was reorganized to Beadleston and Woerz. We see that in this 1879 directory. Now, during all of these changes, they were gradually updating the old prison building, slowly phasing out different portions of the prison buildings until 1881, when the last of the old prison buildings were knocked down, and it ended up being a grand 7-story brick plant with granite facings taking up 10 city lots. Now this brewery became one of the largest and most renowned American breweries. I found an 1886 article talking about an explosion at the factory one night, which was due to testing some new equipment that they installed for refrigeration. 5 people were in the room with the equipment during the explosion, but only one guy got hurt by some falling glass. They said there was an old clock that was used by the old prison that was still being used, but that got smashed in this incident. Here's an 1887, a quick ad saying, Beadleston and Woerz celebrated Imperial Lager beer is bottled at their brewery, gives the address, and says thus assuring absolute purity. In 1889, Ebenezer died at the age of 86. His obituary says that in his later years, he was vice president of the Pacific Bank and director of a few insurance companies. His son, William H. Beadleston, then becomes president until a few short years later, when he died in 1895 at the age of 55. Here's a nice photo of him. I checked on his sons. None of them worked at the brewery that I can see. In fact, I don't think his 2 youngest sons ever worked. I see them in their 20s and their 30s and they still weren't working. So anyways, after William died, we are left with Alfred Beadleston and Ernest Woerz. I had to research all these guys, so there's tons of stuff that I won't get into in this video, but I wanted to touch on the interesting things here and there, and I wanted to mention that Alfred was married twice. The first marriage ended in divorce, and then he married his second wife when she was 21 and he was 60. And she stayed with him until he died. But I'm just saying, only millionaires can do stuff like that. So here's a few times that I found a little ad for them, their little logo. So here's 1898, and in 1901 the same one. Here's a 1910 ad showing the bottle design. So let's skip a few years until about 1913, when the company appears in the Power Wagon magazine. It features photos of their lineup of wagons, stating that the brewery has 10 electric trucks and 5 gasoline trucks, a Packard, a 6-ton sourer, which is this one, along with 35 horses and horse trucks and wagons. Here's a look inside the garage for the electric trucks. Now, I don't know about you, but I was actually rather surprised to learn that some of our earliest automobiles were electric. Now we're up to 1916. Ernest Woerz died at the age of 81. It says that he was vice president and treasurer of the firm. He died of pneumonia. Remember I told you he stayed out of the newspapers until he died? Well, obviously he was very wealthy, and his family started fighting over his money. Apparently he gave each of his 6 grandkids $5,000 in his will, and they thought that they should each get over $500,000. They tried to say that since he wasn't interested in the baseball scores right before he died, that proves that he was insane, meaning he didn't know what he was saying when he made his will. But it actually says that he went back and rectified his will at some point, reducing their inheritance. It's really sad how greedy people get when family dies. I don't know if they won their case or what. So when Ernest died, his son Frederick took over for him. Now the very next year, Alfred died at the age of 69. In his obituary it says that he owned many prize-winning horses which he took to horse shows, and it said he was director of 2 horse shows as well. I did the math, so him and his young little wife were married for 9 years before he died. So she would only be 30 at the time he died. Now she was cute, I'll give her that. She got remarried again, and she was widowed again when her second husband died in a car accident. She apparently was really into horses too, and she died young too. She wasn't yet 50. So Frederick Woerz is the only one left. Now he's president. Here's a passport photo of him. So I went and looked at the directories to kind of see who he brings on with him. The 1920 shows a Mr. Steele as vice president and an H.F.H. Beadleston as secretary-treasurer. Who the heck is that Beadleston? So I looked through all of my notes and I don't know who the heck that guy is. So I wanted to see if we could find his full name somewhere. So I looked in 1922, no. HFH. 1925, no. Well, I guess there's still a Beadleston here, so there's no need to change the name of the company. Some interesting developments after Frederick becomes president. It seems he leased out a large section of the property. Here's an article in 1936 talking about the Empire Brewery softball team victory. You know, why don't we do company sports anymore? I didn't realize how popular it was in decades past. I guess it was just good, clean entertainment before TVs and computers. Well, Frederick dies in 1947. On his bio here, on Find a Grave, it says that he was president for 30 years, which would be true if he was president up until he died. The New York directories skip from 1933 to 1948 to 1953, so there's really big gaps. But I saw the company is still alive in 1948, but by the time the 1953 one, it's gone. So I guess the company wrapped up after Frederick died. So let's look at the address. 297 West 10th Street in New York. Well, here's 295. So I'm not sure if we are meant to be looking at this one on the corner or the one next to it. Now, looking at this old picture, this piece seems more like it's this one. Now, I'm not sure which way it was facing, but maybe if that's that building, then it would be facing like this. So this is what it would look like now. It would have taken up most of this block, I think. I came across one more interesting thing in Google Books. This book was written in 2011, and it talks about this house built in the 1830s, which was originally built as a house. Then the prison system bought it and converted it to a halfway house for women in the 1870s. And then in 1889, Beadleston and Woerz bought it and used it for an office space and for living quarters for some of the workers. They used it all the way up until 1947, which is when we suspect the company ended. It says the building is now a residence again. So I think I found that one too. It looks like both adjacent buildings don't exist anymore. Like, look at this one. This one's missing. And then this one looks like maybe a church. So look at this empty space. And the church is this. This building is going on 200 years old. That's really cool. It's changed though. It looks like maybe it's missing the top floor. Okay, so let's get to the actual bottle here. My bottle says Beadleston and Woerz, which was the company's name for 70 years out of its 120 plus years. I would imagine if anyone was to find a bottle from this company, it would most likely say Beadleston and Woerz. To find any of the other names would be really rare, I would think. So mine is early machine made. You can see the base of the glass is uneven and wonky. If I didn't see the seam all the way up to the top, I would have said that this was blown. This has a blank base, and the pictorial centerpiece depicts two ladies on either side of an emblem with the initials in it, and it's topped with an opened winged bird, and it says Excelsior along the bottom. So I'm going to date this bottle, I want to say maybe late teens to right around maybe 1920, give or take. And I'm not sure which one of these bottles looks more like my bottle. And apparently there were slightly different versions. I don't know the dates that each one of these versions came out, so I wouldn't be able to tell you those. This was a really fun one for me, you guys. I hope it was fun for you. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.